Hi, I'm Elizabeth Gronke from the American Folk Art Museum. I'm an access educator with the Folk Art Reflections program, and this is another video visit just for you. Today we're going to be looking at quilts. Everybody seems to love the quilts at the Folk Art Museum. Now, some of you have some really sweet memories that have been shared with me over the years of family members making quilts. Maybe you remember an aunt or a grandmother or your mother or another family member making a quilt. Some of you might even be quilters. So, this is a very familiar art form using fabric. There's something comforting about it. Now, I want to ask you before we get looking at images, when I say quilt, what is the first thing that you think of? A lot of people tend to think about the colors, the patterns. A lot of people say, oh my gosh, think of all the time that went into making that quilt by hand. So we're going to be thinking and talking about all of those things. And we're also going to be thinking about the way quilts sometimes can bring a community together and sometimes can help a person communicate something very special to them. We're going to be looking at some interesting symbols that are put into quilts, and it will be fun to look for that together. And perhaps you should start thinking about what symbols you would want to put into a quilt if you were to make one. What would be important for you to share? So let's start looking. Here's the first quilt I want to share with you. It's got an interesting story behind it. So take a look at this quilt. It's got a lot of little squares. I'm zooming in so you can see how small those squares are. Just take a look for now and ask yourself, what do you think of it? Do the patterns remind you of anything? Do you like the colors? And can you imagine having to sew each and every little square together? Now, as far as getting clues about the maker of this quilt, it's kind of hard to tell just by looking at it. But if you could see the fabric, that might give you a clue. I'll tell you this, it's made of twill, like worsted wool, so it's quite heavy. In fact, you might even identify that this fabric is made from salvaged uniforms from soldiers. In fact, this type of quilt is sometimes called a soldier's quilt. It's also known as a convalescent quilt because it was made by soldiers who were recovering from illnesses or injuries. And during a certain time in history, especially in Britain, in the mid to late 1800s, soldiers were encouraged to make quilts as a therapeutic activity. Now, the maker or makers of this quilt is unknown, but it was likely that it was made in England, and quite a number of these quilts were made at that time. I like to imagine that more than one soldier worked on this quilt, and that they sort of banded together to make this one a gigantic quilt together. I have to ask you, do you think it would be helpful for you if you were recovering from an injury to have a big activity like that of making a quilt? What's interesting to me is that it was the activity, it was the piecing together of all those little squares of fabric that was sort of the point of that quilt. The end result, of course, was a beautiful bed cover, so that's a benefit, but it was more the making of it. The purpose was in the making. And the next quilt I want to show you also had a very special purpose in its making. Take a look at this beautiful quilt. It's called the Cross River Album Quilt. And before I tell you much more about it, I want you to just take a look at it. What designs catch your eye here? There are so many recognizable shapes, like I see flowers, there are vines at the top and the bottom. If you want, you can pause the video and point out to each other what you're noticing in this quilt, because there's a lot to see. But if we were to get up really, really close to this quilt, here's a detail. We would see signature. Do you see the signature as part of the basket? There's also a date. In fact, there are 11 signatures on this quilt. And those are the 11 women that lived in Cross River, New York in 1861 who made this quilt. Now, we think this quilt might have been a fundraiser for soldiers in the Civil War because 1861 was the start of the Civil War. And if you'll notice, one of the squares near the bottom is an American flag, and the word Union is written on it. And we do know that at this time in history, in this location, there were quilts being made to raise money for things like the Soldiers' Aid Society. So it's quite possible that the 11 women who made this quilt were making it for a cause like that. Here's a fun fact. All 11 of the makers of this quilt have been found on public record as living in the Cross River area of New York State. And at the time when this quilt was made in 1861, they ranged in age from 15 to 55. And it just delights me to think about an intergenerational group of women working on a project together for a cause that they believe in. And we're still looking at it today. I just find that very, very touching. The next quilt we're going to look at, as far as we know, was made by one person. And it happens to be my favorite quilt style. That is the Crazy Quilt. Can you see why this is called a Crazy Quilt? The colors and the patchwork are more random, and there is just so much to see here. Now, please feel free to pause the video at this point, and you can look for one or two recognizable items to share with each other. There's just a lot in here. Did any of you notice the red rooster in the center of the quilt? That rooster and the small figures, figurative patches around that rooster are big clues about who made this quilt. This quilt is actually a very bold political statement. It turns out that the rooster was a commonly used symbol of the Democratic Party when this was made in the late 1800s. And the figures that are at the top of the patch where the rooster is actually Grover Cleveland and his running mate, Thomas Hendricks. And the more you look, the more you'll see other political figures and political symbolism all throughout this quilt. You can also find popular motifs of the day, like the lucky horseshoe, the fan. I see a moon. What else do you see? Now, one of the reasons we think that this elaborate and stylish quilt is made by one person is because that there are initials sewn into the quilt. That's JFR. We still don't know who that person is. The odds are very high that this was a woman who made the quilt. And I sincerely hope that when 1920 came around and women finally got the right to vote, I hope that this woman, who clearly cared a lot about her political system and her party, got the chance to vote. Let's look at some of the quilts we saw today. So we've seen how quilt making can be therapeutic and possibly a collaborative activity, as it was for the recuperating soldiers who made this quilt. We've seen how a group of 11 women in a small town in New York worked together to possibly raise money for a meaningful cause. And we've seen the work of one artist who communicated her love of her political party in a most colorful patchwork of fabrics. So now I'm inviting you to participate in a collaborative quilt. The American Folk Art Museum thought that in this time of social distancing, it would be really wonderful to create a project in which we all collaborate to make a digital quilt. I'm adding a PDF to the description section, which is below the video on the page where the YouTube video is, and look for an attachment that will give you this page. It's actually 5 pages long. It's going to introduce you to a few different kinds of quilts and give you a template or two in which to color and decorate any way that suits you. I would love to see some of the symbols that are important to you and for you to have a chance to express your very own style and to add to this wonderful way of showing our community. I decided to participate too. After I printed it out, I chose the Friendship Star template and I cut out some colorful pieces from a newspaper that was hanging around and I glued them down and added some color to the edge. Of course, you can do whatever you want, and I'm looking forward to seeing what you make. Then I had to cut it out, and this is the important part to getting it on the quilt. After you cut it out, you have to photograph it on a dark background and then email that photo to this address, this email address, and we will put it up on our digital quilt. I'm so glad you could join me today and I could share some of my favorite quilts with you. And I look forward to seeing you at the next Folk Art Reflections video visit.